My beloved child. Pause here, because there is something your heart has been trying to understand through all the silence, and the answer is closer than it has ever been. You have wondered whether they ever truly loved you, whether your absence touched them, whether the words you waited so long to hear were ever formed inside their heart. But what if those words were finally spoken only after the place where you once stood had become empty? What if they said, "I love you," at the exact moment they realized you were no longer waiting to hear it? Do not turn away yet. The most important part is not that they finally said it. The deeper truth is why it took losing access to your heart for them to understand what had always been there. You carried this pain quietly. You learned how to smile while questions lived beneath your ribs. You tried to act as though the distance did not hurt, as though the unanswered messages, unfinished conversations, and inconsistent affection had not slowly exhausted something sacred within you. There were nights when you replayed moments that probably looked ordinary to everyone else. A glance that lasted too long. A sentence that almost became a confession. A goodbye that felt heavier than it should have. You kept wondering if you imagined the connection because they never gave it a clear name. Yet your heart was not foolish for feeling deeply. You were simply loving someone who had not yet learned how to stand honestly inside their own emotions. That difference matters. In this fictional reflection, imagine heaven watching two hearts move through the same story at different speeds. One heart recognized the connection early and tried to protect it. The other felt it but became frightened by its depth. You were not necessarily stronger because you loved first, and they were not necessarily cruel because they struggled to speak. But silence has consequences. Hesitation creates distance. And when one person keeps waiting while the other keeps hiding, eventually love begins to feel less like a gift and more like a room without air. You stayed longer than anyone knew. You stayed through confusion. You stayed through mixed signals. You stayed when your intuition whispered that something real existed beneath their guarded behavior. You offered patience because you understood that people carry wounds they do not always know how to explain. You gave them room. You tried not to pressure them. You accepted small moments because you believed they might one day grow into something whole. But patience should never require you to disappear from your own life. That was the lesson forming inside you, even while your heart resisted it. The turning point did not begin with anger. It began with exhaustion. One night, long after the world had gone quiet, you found yourself staring at a message you had written but never sent. The room was still. Maybe rain touched the window. Maybe the only light came from your phone screen. You read your own words and realized they were full of explanations you had already given in 100 different ways. You were asking to be seen by someone who had witnessed your love and still remained uncertain about what to do with it. Your hand hovered over the screen. For a moment, you almost sent another honest message. Another chance. Another doorway. But something within you became quiet. Not cold. Not bitter. Quiet. It was the stillness that arrives when your soul is finally too tired to argue with what reality has been showing you. You did not stop caring in that moment. In some ways, you cared more deeply than ever. But you began to understand that loving someone did not mean you had to remain available for endless uncertainty. So you deleted the message. They did not know that decision had been made. They did not hear a door slam. They did not see you fall apart. There was no dramatic final scene, no angry accusation, no last attempt to force a confession from them. You simply began withdrawing your energy from the place where it had been waiting without shelter. And that silence reached them differently than all your words ever had. At first, they told themselves nothing had changed. They assumed you needed time. They believed you would return to the familiar pattern. Perhaps they expected your name to appear on their screen again, carrying warmth, concern, or some small excuse to reconnect. They had grown accustomed to the way your presence softened the distance between you. Even when they did not openly acknowledge your importance, they depended upon the emotional certainty that you were still there. That certainty became invisible because it had always been available. But then a day passed. Then another. And the space where your attention used to live remained empty. This was when their heart began noticing what their mind had ignored. A song played, and they remembered the way you once described a feeling you could not fully explain. They saw something you would have laughed at, and instinctively reached for their phone before stopping. They walked into a familiar room and felt the strange absence of someone who was never physically there, yet somehow had filled the space. Your absence did not shout. It echoed. That echo became impossible to escape. They began returning to old conversations, not because they planned to confess anything, but because they were searching for the exact moment your tone changed. They scrolled slowly, noticing details they had overlooked before. The way you asked if they were okay even when you were hurting. The way you remembered small things. The way you offered reassurance without demanding anything in return. They saw your patience differently now. Before, they had mistaken it for permanence. Now, they recognized it as love. But the discovery frightened them because another realization arrived with it: patience has an ending when it is not honored. There was one particular message they could not stop reading. It may have been simple. Perhaps you had written, "I just want you to be honest with me." Perhaps you said, "You don't have to promise anything. Just don't make me feel foolish for caring." Or maybe it was something even quieter, a sentence that revealed how little you were asking for and how deeply they still failed to meet you there. They read it again. And again. The words that once felt easy to postpone now carried the weight of a goodbye they had not recognized when it was happening. This is where the story begins to change. Because they did not suddenly understand only that they missed you. Missing someone can be temporary. It can come from loneliness, habit, or wounded pride. What opened inside them was more difficult to dismiss. They began to see the difference between wanting your attention and valuing your heart. They realized your presence had never been ordinary. It had been a kind of emotional refuge, and they had stood at its doorway afraid to enter while secretly hoping it would remain open forever. The truth was uncomfortable. They had loved being loved by you. But had they loved you courageously enough? That question followed them everywhere. During the day, they distracted themselves. They stayed busy. They answered other messages, handled responsibilities, and acted as though the silence between you was just another temporary distance. But at night, the defenses became weaker. The mind can control a story when the world is loud. In stillness, the heart often speaks without permission. One evening, they sat alone in a dim room. The clock had moved past midnight. The glow from a nearby screen painted the walls in pale light. Outside, rain moved gently against the glass, and for reasons they could not explain, they remembered the sound of your voice when you were trying not to cry. You had said you were fine. They had known you were not. Yet they let the moment pass. That memory broke through them. Not violently. Slowly. It began as pressure in the chest, then a tightening in the throat, then the sudden awareness that they had been given opportunities to choose honesty and had answered with fear. They remembered every almost confession, every time they nearly told you how much you mattered, every moment they pulled back because speaking the truth would have made the connection real. And real love asks something of a person. It asks them to risk rejection. It asks them to become visible. It asks them to stop hiding behind confusion when the heart already knows. They had avoided those risks. But avoiding pain did not protect them. It only delayed the pain until it became larger. They opened your conversation again. Their fingers trembled over the keyboard. They typed your name. Deleted it. Typed, "Are you awake?" Deleted that too. Then they wrote the sentence you had once prayed to hear. "I love you." 3 words. So small on the screen. So enormous inside the silence. But they did not send it. Not yet. Because the moment they saw those words, they understood something that terrified them. Saying it now might not bring you back. The confession they once believed could wait had become powerless against the possibility that your heart had already chosen peace. They stared at the unsent message while tears blurred the screen. For the first time, they were not afraid that loving you would change their life. They were afraid they had waited until your life changed without them. But this is not the entire revelation. There was another reason the confession came so late, and it was connected to a hidden wound they had never shown you. They had learned long ago to associate love with loss. Somewhere in their past, closeness had become dangerous. Perhaps someone promised to stay and disappeared. Perhaps affection had been used as control. Perhaps they had watched love turn into betrayal, instability, or silence. So when your presence began touching places inside them that had been closed for years, they did not experience only warmth, they experienced alarm. Your kindness awakened desire, but it also awakened fear. You saw their distance and wondered if you were not enough. They felt your closeness and secretly feared that you were too important. That does not erase the pain they caused. Understanding is not the same as excusing. Their wounds may explain why they struggled, but wounds do not give anyone the right to keep another heart suspended indefinitely. Still, this hidden conflict changes the meaning of certain moments. Do you remember how they sometimes moved closer and then suddenly became distant? How they could be deeply present one day and emotionally unavailable the next? You may have interpreted it as a lack of feeling. But in this imagined story, the opposite was often true. The stronger the connection became, the more intensely their defenses reacted. They were not always running from you. Sometimes, they were running from who they became around you. With you, they felt seen. Not admired from a distance. Seen. You noticed the sadness beneath their humor. You recognized when their silence carried more than tiredness. You asked questions that reached behind the version of themselves they showed everyone else. And though they longed for that kind of intimacy, they did not know how to receive it without feeling exposed. So they gave you fragments. Enough to keep the bond alive. Never enough to make you feel secure. And while they fought an invisible battle within themselves, you fought a different battle, the fear that your love had been meaningless. It was not meaningless. But meaning alone cannot sustain a relationship. Love can be real and still arrive in an unhealthy form. Two people can care deeply and still be unable to build something safe. A connection can be spiritually significant without being permission to abandon your dignity. This is why your departure became necessary. Not as punishment. Not as a strategy to make them chase you. Not as a test. You left because staying had begun teaching your heart to accept less than honesty. Your absence became the boundary your words could not establish. And that boundary forced the truth into the light. The next morning, they woke after barely sleeping. The unsent message remained on the screen. The words were still there. I love you. For several minutes, they simply looked at them. There was a strange tenderness in the room, as if dawn itself had entered carefully. A thin line of light appeared through the curtains. The world outside was beginning again, yet they felt as though they were standing at the end of something they had failed to recognize while it was alive. They wondered where you were. Were you sleeping peacefully? Were you crying too? Had you finally told someone else the things you once tried to tell them? Had your heart already begun learning how to live without checking for their name? That final thought caused something inside them to collapse. They pressed send. The message traveled instantly. But no reply came. Minutes passed. They checked the screen. Still nothing. An hour passed. Then two. Every sound made them look at their phone. Every vibration sent hope through their body, only to disappear when it was not you. They tried to focus on other things, but the confession now existed outside them. It was no longer hidden. The truth had finally been released. Yet it had entered silence. This was the reverse of everything you had endured. You had spent so long offering emotional truth into uncertainty. Now they were the one waiting, wondering whether their vulnerability mattered, whether their message had been seen, whether the person on the other side still cared enough to answer. But there is a detail you do not know yet. You had seen the message. Your eyes rested on those words, the very words your heart had once begged to receive. I love you. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Every version of you existed at once, the hopeful version who would have answered immediately, the wounded version who wanted to cry, the angry version who wanted to ask why it had taken so long, and the stronger version who had learned that words must be measured against patterns. You did not feel nothing. That is important. You were not cold. You were not indifferent. Your heart reacted before your wisdom could speak. A rush of emotion moved through you, carrying memories, prayers, imagined futures, and all the nights when hearing those words would have changed everything. But now they did not change everything. They changed the meaning of what had already happened. The confession gave you clarity, but not necessarily the outcome you once desired. You set the phone down. Your hands were unsteady. Perhaps you walked to a window. Perhaps morning light rested across the floor, and you watched the world moving as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Cars passed. Birds crossed the sky. Somewhere, someone laughed. Yet inside you, an old ache opened beside a new kind of strength. You had waited so long for validation. Now that it had arrived, you discovered you no longer needed it to prove that your love had been real. That was the miracle hidden beneath the heartbreak. You believed you were waiting for them to say, I love you. But your deeper journey was teaching you to say, I will not abandon myself. The two truths met in that quiet morning. They loved you. And they had still failed to love you in the way you needed. Both could be true. That realization did not make the choice easy. In some ways, it made it harder. It would have been simpler if they had never cared. You could have called the entire connection an illusion and walked away cleanly. But knowing that the feeling was real forced you to grieve something more complicated, not the absence of love, but the tragedy of love arriving without readiness. This is the grief few people understand. It is the pain of knowing that a beautiful possibility existed but was not protected. It is mourning what could have grown if fear had not spoken louder than courage. It is hearing the right words after the version of you who needed them has already been changed by their absence. You read the message again. Not because you wanted to punish yourself, but because part of you needed to know it truly existed. You had imagined that sentence so many times. You had wondered what it would feel like. You thought it might bring relief, joy, or a flood of certainty. Instead, it brought silence. Not empty silence. Sacred silence. The kind in which your heart asks a new question, is this confession enough to rebuild what uncertainty destroyed? You did not know the answer. And somewhere across the distance, they were beginning to understand that love spoken late cannot demand immediate forgiveness. A confession is not a key that automatically reopens every door. It is only truth. What happens after truth depends upon humility, accountability, timing, and whether two people are still willing and able to meet each other honestly. They sent another message. I should have told you sooner. You saw it. Then another arrived. I was scared. A pause. You mattered more than I knew how to handle. Your breath caught. These were not excuses disguised as affection. For the first time, they were naming the fear beneath the distance. They were speaking from the place you had always sensed existed but could never reach. And still, something within you remained cautious. Because people often become honest when consequences arrive. The question is whether their honesty can survive once comfort returns. You had learned not to build hope on emotional intensity alone. A late-night confession can be sincere and still not become lasting change. Tears can be real. Regret can be real. Love can be real. But real feelings do not automatically create healthy behavior. You needed more than the emotional moment. You needed evidence that they understood what their silence had cost you. They were about to discover that too. Hours later, they called. You watched the phone ring. Their name filled the screen. Once, seeing it would have made your heart leap. Now it made your heart ache. You did not answer. Not because you wanted control. Not because you hoped to make them suffer. You simply were not ready to let their urgency decide the pace of your healing. The call stopped. Then came again. You closed your eyes. Somewhere within the quiet, you imagined all the things they might say. You imagined their voice breaking. You imagined yourself asking every question you had carried. Why did you wait? Why did you make me doubt myself? Why did you pull me close only to disappear when I believed you? But another voice within you whispered, not yet. So you allowed the phone to fall silent. That silence changed them more deeply than rejection would have. If you had answered in anger, they might have defended themselves. If you had immediately forgiven them, they might have mistaken emotion for repair. But your quiet boundary left them alone with the truth. There was no argument to win. No blame to redirect. Only the consequences of delay. They stood in a hallway after the call ended, holding the phone with both hands. The house around them felt unusually still. Every room seemed to contain a memory of a conversation with you. The kitchen reminded them of the night you stayed awake while they talked about a problem they had never shared with anyone else. The window reminded them of the photograph you once sent of a sunset. Even the chair near the wall seemed connected to the hours they had spent reading your messages while pretending you were not becoming important. Then they remembered something they had forgotten. A voice message. Months earlier, you had sent it late at night. At the time, they listened once and replied with something brief. They had not understood why your voice sounded different. Now they searched through the conversation until they found it. They pressed play. Your voice entered the empty room. You sounded gentle, but tired. You told them you cared. You said you did not want to pressure them. You said you understood that they needed time. But near the end, your voice trembled as you added, I just hope one day you realize I was never asking you to be perfect. I was only asking you not to leave me alone inside something we both felt. They stopped breathing for a moment. The message ended. The silence afterward felt unbearable. They played it again. This time, they heard what had been hidden in plain sight. You had not been demanding a future. You had been asking for emotional honesty. You were not trying to trap them. You were trying to understand whether you were standing alone in a connection that belonged to both of you. They covered their face. And for the first time, they cried without trying to stop. Heaven, in this symbolic story, did not celebrate their pain. There was no satisfaction in watching regret unfold. Spiritual truth is not revenge. The purpose of consequence is not humiliation. It is awakening. Their tears were not punishment. They were recognition. They finally understood that your departure had not been sudden. It had happened slowly, one unanswered need at a time. Every time you reached and they retreated, a small part of you learned to let go. Every time you expressed hurt and they offered vagueness, another thread loosened. By the time you became quiet, the leaving had already been happening inside you for a long time. They had mistaken the absence of a dramatic ending for the absence of an ending. Now the truth stood before them. You were already gone before they said, "I love you." Not gone from the world. Not erased from feeling. But gone from the place where you waited without limits. Gone from the version of yourself who believed one confession could repair every wound. Gone from the emotional doorway where you had stood, hoping they would eventually choose courage. And yet, even this was not the deepest truth. Because part of you was still listening. Not waiting. Listening. There is a difference. Waiting makes your life pause until another person decides. Listening allows you to remain open without surrendering your direction. You were no longer asking their confession to determine your worth. You were considering whether their truth belonged in your future at all. That shift was powerful. They sensed it even without hearing your voice. For the next several days, they did not send endless messages. Something within them understood that flooding you with emotion would only repeat the same pattern in a new form. Instead, they began writing a letter. Not a performance. Not a desperate attempt to make you return. A real account of what they had been afraid to admit. The first page was filled with apologies. They tore it up because the words sounded too polished. The second page explained their past, but they destroyed that one too because it seemed like they were using pain to escape responsibility. On the third attempt, they finally wrote one honest sentence. I loved you while pretending I did not know what love was asking me to do. They stared at it for a long time. Then they continued. They wrote about the first moment they realized you were different. It had not been dramatic. Perhaps you remembered a detail everyone else forgot. Perhaps you listened without interrupting. Perhaps you looked at them with a gentleness that made them feel both safe and exposed. They wrote about the nights they almost called you. The times they typed messages and erased them. The moments they became jealous but acted indifferent. The way your name affected them even when they tried to deny it. They admitted that they had sometimes withheld reassurance because giving it would have required them to acknowledge how deeply attached they had become. They confessed that they feared dependence, so they created distance, never realizing that distance was teaching you how to survive without them. Every line brought them closer to the truth. But the letter also uncovered something unexpected. There had been a specific moment when they nearly told you everything. It happened weeks before you left. You had been talking quietly. Your voice carried that familiar warmth, but beneath it was sadness. You said something about moving forward. Maybe you mentioned changing your life, focusing on yourself, or releasing what no longer brought peace. They heard the seriousness in your words. Fear rose inside them. They wanted to say, "Don't go." They wanted to say, "I love you." Instead, they gave a careful answer. Something safe. Something emotionally neutral. You became quiet. They remembered the exact sound of that silence. At the time, they convinced themselves they had prevented a difficult conversation. Now they understood that the conversation continued inside you without them. Their silence answered the question you had not directly asked. You took their hesitation as your permission to leave. That memory became the center of the letter. They wrote, "The moment you gave me the chance to be honest, I chose safety. I thought I was protecting myself. I did not understand I was teaching you to stop hoping." The confession was no longer only, "I love you." It was, "I see what my fear did to you." That distinction matters because love without self-awareness often repeats its harm. Regret becomes meaningful only when it leads to understanding. While they wrote, you were undergoing your own transformation. You had not replied, but their words continued moving through you. Some moments, you felt compassion. Other moments, anger returned. Grief came in waves. 1 hour you wanted to hear their voice, the next, you wanted to protect the peace you had worked so hard to recover. You wondered whether your silence was cruel. It was not. Taking time is not cruelty. You had spent so long accommodating their confusion that honoring your own uncertainty felt unfamiliar. You were learning that you did not owe an immediate answer simply because they had finally become emotionally available. You began praying differently. Before, your prayers may have focused on them, asking for clarity, asking for a sign, asking for their heart to open. Now your prayer became, "Help me choose what is healthy, not merely what I have desired." That was a brave prayer. Because sometimes what you have desired and what will heal you are not the same thing. Sometimes they eventually become the same, but only after genuine change. Sometimes love must be released. Sometimes it must be rebuilt slowly. And sometimes the greatest answer is not reunion or separation, but wisdom. You were no longer demanding a specific ending. You were asking for truth. In the stillness after that prayer, you felt no dramatic sign. No voice declared what you should do. Instead, a quiet awareness came over you. You did not need to decide your entire future today. You only needed to remain honest. So you finally replied. 3 words. I saw it. When the message reached them, they froze. You had not said you loved them too. You had not offered forgiveness. You had not closed the door. You had simply confirmed that their confession had been received. Those 3 words held more power than a long emotional answer. I saw it. You saw the message. You saw the fear. You saw the regret. And perhaps, at last, you saw them clearly not as the person you hoped they would become, but as the person they had actually been and the person they might now be trying to become. They typed a response immediately, then stopped. They wanted to ask if there was still a chance. They wanted reassurance. They wanted to know whether you missed them, whether you still loved them, whether your silence meant the end. But for once, they recognized that their need for certainty could not come before your need for safety. So they wrote, "You don't have to answer yet. I just need you to know I am sorry I waited until you had to leave to become honest." You read the sentence slowly. There it was. Not the confession you had once imagined. Something deeper. Accountability. Your eyes filled with tears. You let them fall. Not because you had made a decision, but because your pain had finally been witnessed by the person who caused much of it. For so long, you feared they would never understand. You thought you might carry the entire emotional truth alone. Now they were naming it. And yet the question remained, was understanding enough? The answer could not be rushed. Words spoken under the pressure of loss can be powerful, but character is revealed by what happens after the emotional storm. Would they respect your pace? Would they remain truthful even without immediate reward? Would they accept the possibility that love might not restore what delay had damaged? Their next actions would reveal more than their confession. This is why the story does not end with, "I love you." Those words opened the door to a harder truth: love is not proven only by feeling. It is proven by the courage to take responsibility for how your choices affect another heart. Days passed. They did not disappear. But they also did not pressure you. Once each morning, they wrote a short message. Not dramatic. Not demanding. One said, "I hope today is gentle with you." Another said, "I understand if silence is what you need." Another simply read, "I am working on becoming honest even if you never return." You did not answer most of them. Still, you noticed the change. Before, their silence had been a form of avoidance. Now, their restraint seemed to be an act of respect. But you were careful. Consistency takes time to reveal itself. Your heart wanted to believe. Your wisdom wanted to observe. You began noticing your own inner conflict more clearly. Part of you feared that replying would pull you back into the same uncertainty. Another part feared that staying silent might close a door that had finally become real. You were standing between the pain of the past and the possibility of a different future. Neither direction felt simple. Then the letter arrived. Not electronically. A real envelope. Your name was written across the front in handwriting you recognized immediately. You held it for a long time before opening it. The weight of the paper felt strangely significant. This was not a message that could be deleted, edited, or hidden behind typing indicators. They had placed their thoughts into something physical and sent it without knowing how you would receive it. You sat somewhere quiet. Perhaps beside a window. Perhaps on the edge of your bed. Perhaps in the same place where you had once deleted the final message you almost sent. Your fingers moved carefully beneath the seal. The letter unfolded. The first sentence made your breath catch. "I know saying I love you does not undo the nights you questioned whether you were loved." You stopped reading. Your eyes closed. That sentence reached the exact place inside you that had been most wounded. They understood. At least, they were beginning to. You continued. They wrote about fear. About avoidance. About the false belief that keeping emotions unspoken would keep them safe. They described the moment they realized your absence was not a temporary pause. They told you about the voice message they replayed and the way your words exposed what they had refused to see. Then they wrote something you did not expect. "I thought you were the one who needed my answer. Now I understand I was the one being offered a chance to become honest." You read that line twice. The story had shifted. For so long, you saw yourself as the person waiting to be chosen. But perhaps you had also been the person offering them a doorway into courage. Your love had not been weak. It had been an invitation. They were simply too frightened to accept it while you were standing there. Now the doorway was no longer theirs to assume. They continued. "I do not know whether I have any place in your life now. I do not know whether the words came too late. I am not asking you to rescue me from that uncertainty. You lived inside uncertainty because of me, and I finally understand how painful that was." Your tears fell onto the page. This was what your heart had wanted, not merely romance, but recognition. Still, one section of the letter remained folded behind the others. You noticed the paper was thicker there, as though something had been enclosed. Your hands trembled. Before unfolding it, you looked toward the fading light outside. The day had grown quiet. Shadows stretched across the room. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured, and the air carried the feeling of a storm approaching without fear. You unfolded the final page. A photograph slipped into your lap. It was an old photograph. One you did not know existed. The image showed a place connected to the two of you. Perhaps a quiet cafe, a street corner, a bench, or a gathering where you had first begun noticing each other. In the photograph, you were turned away, unaware that the picture had been taken. They stood in the background, looking at you. Not casually. Not indifferently. The expression on their face held a tenderness so unguarded that you barely recognized them. On the back of the photograph, they had written a date. The date was much earlier than you expected. Beneath it, one sentence appeared. This was the day I first knew I loved you. Your entire understanding shifted. They had known. Not fully, perhaps. Not bravely. But somewhere within themselves, they had known long before the distance, long before the mixed signals, long before the night they finally typed the confession. You turned back to the letter, searching for the explanation. The final paragraphs began. I kept this photograph because I was afraid of what it proved. Every time I looked at it, I saw a version of myself who had already chosen you in his heart, even while his actions kept refusing to admit it. But there is something else about that day that you never knew. Something happened after this picture was taken. It is the reason I became distant, the reason I almost told you the truth, and the reason I believed loving you would eventually destroy everything I had tried to protect. Your pulse quickened. The next line had been crossed out. Beneath it, they had rewritten the sentence more carefully. I have spent all this time letting you believe my silence meant you were not loved, when the truth is that someone found out how I felt before I ever confessed it to you. You stopped. The room seemed to narrow around you. Someone else had known. Someone had discovered the truth. And whatever happened afterward had shaped every painful moment that followed. You turned the page, but the explanation was not there. Instead, at the bottom of the letter, they had written, I could not put the rest on paper. If you are willing, meet me at the place in the photograph tomorrow before sunset. I will tell you who knew, what they said to me, and why I chose to lose you rather than reveal the secret I had been carrying. You held the letter against your chest as the first drops of rain began tapping against the window. For hours, you told yourself you would not go. You had protected your peace too carefully to step back into mystery. You placed the photograph inside the envelope. You walked away from it. You tried to focus on anything else. But the final sentence followed you. Why had they believed losing you was safer than telling you the truth? This was no longer only about fear of love. There was another person. Another conversation. Another hidden moment that had shaped the entire story. Night came slowly. You stood in the darkened room, watching distant lights blur through the rain. Your phone remained silent. They did not ask whether you had received the letter. They did not pressure you to come. The choice was entirely yours. You thought about the person you had been when the photograph was taken. Open-hearted. Hopeful. Still unaware of what loving them would cost. You thought about the person you were now. Wiser. More guarded. No longer willing to trade peace for promises. Then you asked yourself a question you had avoided all day: was meeting them a return to the past, or was it simply a chance to finally hear the truth and close the door with full understanding? You did not know. But you sensed that the answer depended upon how you entered that meeting. Not as the one begging to be chosen. Not as the one trying to restore an old dream. As someone who had already chosen herself. That changed everything. Morning arrived pale and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the streets shining beneath a clear sky. You moved through the day with the letter folded inside your bag. Every hour brought you closer to the time they had named. You could still decide not to go. You reminded yourself of that often. Choice was now in your hands. Late in the afternoon, you found yourself standing before a mirror. You were not preparing to impress them. You were preparing to remain grounded. You looked into your own eyes and silently promised that no confession, no secret, and no emotional moment would make you betray the healing you had fought to build. Then you left. The journey to the place in the photograph felt longer than you remembered. Familiar streets carried unfamiliar weight. The sky had begun turning gold. The air was cool and clean after the rain. As you approached, you saw them. They were already there. Standing alone. Holding something in their hands. For a moment, neither of you moved. Distance had made them both familiar and strange. You recognized the posture, the face, the way they looked at you as though words had suddenly become impossible. But there was something different in their expression. No defense. No practiced calm. Only truth. They took one step forward, then stopped, allowing you to decide the remaining distance. "I didn't think you would come," they said. Their voice trembled. You answered quietly, "I almost didn't." They nodded, accepting the honesty. Silence gathered between you, but it was not the old silence. The old silence had hidden things. This one demanded that they be revealed. They looked down at what they were holding. Another envelope. Older than the first. Worn at the edges. "This is what I should have shown you a long time ago," they said. You felt your chest tighten. "What is it?" They did not answer immediately. Instead, they looked toward the place where the photograph had been taken. Their eyes carried grief, but also relief, as if reaching this moment had required them to walk through every fear they once used to avoid you. "The day that picture was taken," they began, "someone saw the way I looked at you." "Who?" Their hand tightened around the envelope. "Someone whose opinion controlled more of my life than I ever admitted." The fading sunlight touched their face. You waited. "They told me that loving you would force me to choose between you and something I had spent years trying to protect." Your heart pounded. What did they want you to protect? Their eyes returned to yours. "My family's secret." The words settled heavily between you. You stared at the envelope. "What does that have to do with me?" They swallowed. "More than you know." You took a slow breath, reminding yourself to remain steady. They continued, "I thought distancing myself would keep you outside of it. I told myself I was protecting you. But the truth is, I was also protecting myself from having to face what happened." "What happened?" Their eyes filled with tears. They held out the envelope, but when you reached for it, they did not release it immediately. "There is a name inside," they whispered. "A name you will recognize." The world seemed to become silent. Your fingers remained on the paper. They looked at you with an expression of grief so deep that your anger briefly gave way to fear, not fear of danger, but fear of how completely the truth might change your understanding. "This person knew about you before I ever introduced you," they said. They knew where you came from. They knew what your family had survived. And when they saw us together, they told me something about the past that I could not believe. Your breath became shallow. "What did they tell you?" They finally released the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should feel. "Open it," they said. You looked down. The envelope was sealed with old tape. A date had been written in the corner. It was from years before you and this person had ever met. You carefully pulled the tape away. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the bottom was not. Your hands began to shake. You read the name once. Then again. It belonged to someone connected to your own past, someone whose role in your life had never been fully explained, someone whose silence had left questions your family rarely answered. You looked up sharply. How do you have this? Their face had gone pale. Because it was found among my father's things after he died. The air left your lungs. You opened the letter. The first lines were faded, but readable. They described a promise made many years ago. A promise involving two families. A broken trust. And a child who was never supposed to learn the truth. You stared at the page. Your vision blurred. What is this? They stepped closer, their voice barely more than a whisper. This is why I ran from you. You shook your head. I don't understand. I didn't either. Not at first. They pointed toward the middle of the letter. There. Read that part. You followed their hand. The words became clearer. The writer described a decision that had separated two people who loved each other. A sacrifice made to protect reputations. A secret carried for years. Then came a sentence that made your heart stop. One day, our children may meet without knowing what was taken from us. You looked up. Their tears were falling now. Our families knew each other, they said. Long before we were born. The ground beneath the story seemed to shift. The strange familiarity you had always felt. The intensity neither of you could explain. The way certain relatives reacted when your connection became visible. It was all suddenly connected to something older. But they had not finished. There is another page, they said. You looked inside the envelope. A second sheet remained folded at the bottom. It was newer than the first. Written in handwriting you recognized. The person standing before you stepped back as though they feared what would happen when you read it. That page was written after someone learned we had met, they said. It was sent to me privately. Who wrote it? Their lips parted, but no sound came. You unfolded the paper. At the top was your name. Below it, a warning. Do not tell them what happened between our families. Do not let them discover why they were really sent away. If they learn the truth, they will never forgive any of us. Your entire body went still. You had spent years believing one version of your past. Now the letter suggested that version had been carefully constructed. You looked at the signature. The name belonged to someone you trusted. Someone who had always claimed to protect you. Someone who had encouraged you to walk away from this relationship without ever fully explaining why. You whispered the name aloud. The person before you nodded. They contacted me the day after the photograph was taken. Your voice cracked. What did they say? They said if I loved you, I would leave you alone. Why? They closed their eyes. When they opened them again, the final secret stood behind their expression. Because they believed that if we stayed together, you would eventually discover what they did to keep our families apart. You clutched the letters. What did they do? They looked past you toward the darkening horizon, as though gathering the strength to speak words that had destroyed generations of silence. Then they faced you fully. The person whose name is on that page did not just hide the truth from you, they said. They were the reason you lost someone you spent your entire life believing had willingly abandoned you. Your heartbeat thundered. The light around you faded into evening. You could barely breathe. Who did I lose? They stepped closer, tears shining in their eyes. And as they reached into their coat for the final photograph, the one that would prove everything, they whispered, "Before I tell you, you need to understand that the person you mourned was never gone by choice, and the last message they ever wrote was addressed to you.